Okay, welcome everybody to the first episode of 7 Minute Expert. The goal of this podcast is going to be to discuss interesting issues in American policy and American politics and discuss them with experts in different fields who will provide specific angles on those issues and then provide a picture that is clear and concise because we all know that the media is not great at that, and that you'll have a lot of people talking about issues that they don't actually know a thing about. So my name is Gideon Asquith. I don't know anything about most of these topics, and that's why we're going to learn about them together. So with me, I have Benjamin Craig, who I had met over in a summer in DC, and we are going to be talking about Trump's interesting idea of buying Greenland. Is this a real idea? Is this not? It seems to be that it might be. Last summer, I was a fellow on a program called Hertog Political Studies, and we heard from former National Security Advisor John Bolton, who is certainly no friend of Trump. He actually just revoked his security clearance and security detail today. But John Bolton had said that the issue of buying Greenland was a very serious intelligence and security proposition from the previous administration, and was a longstanding policy, actually, of the United States to try to expand into more Arctic territory. And lastly, and obviously, with the purchase of Alaska. And we're going to try to understand, is that a real idea or is it not? So, Ben, if you could provide us just some background on you, who you are, and why you might be a good person to learn from on this issue.
Yeah, so like you said, my name is Benjamin Craig. I'm currently a Staff Sergeant in the United States Marine Corps, active duty. I've been in for just under 10 years. Let me preface with, this isn't the opinion of the U.S. government. This is just me doing a favor and giving my opinion on stuff. So please don't take it that way. But I have worked in the national security sphere now for a couple of years, and I've done multiple deployments all over the world. I've done time in both Europe, Africa, a lot of time in Asia. So I've had a fairly well-rounded experience, and I'm also just a big reader. And so I like to think I know this a little bit, so maybe I can provide some context that will help.
You know a lot. You are very knowledgeable, and thank you. Obviously, thank you for your service to our country. So is this? Let's just start off with the big question: is this a real idea? Is this not?
So I don't know if I can speak to specific Trump policy because obviously I'm not running it, and I'm definitely not privy to those conversations. I would say that the likelihood of it being real is that either it's real in the sense of it's a national security issue and Trump thinks he knows the best way to handle that, which is by purchasing or at least coming into a higher level of an agreement with Greenland. The flip side of it, though, it also, in my opinion at least, might be a helpful tool to build a stronger relationship and influence within Greenland that can protect U.S. national security interests.
So what might those interests be? Because I see people talking about minerals there and also talking about some energy issues, but I don't really understand. What are those mineral issues, energy issues? Like, why do we need Greenland? We have a lot of energy. I assume we have minerals.
Basically, why do we care about this giant rock in the middle of the Arctic?
Yeah, exactly. Why do we care about what I understand is just a frozen wasteland that Vikings named Greenland as a joke?
Mm-hmm. So to give a little background, Greenland has actually been very important for the U.S. pretty much since, I would say, when it became very important would probably be during World War II, because even though Greenland by itself is fairly remote, it has access to a lot of very important waterways. So, for instance, a lot of U.S. shipping that was going to Europe during the war, especially to England during the Blitz, was going through Greenland, or at least would stop off in Greenland and at ports in Greenland. And then after the war ended, it became even more vitally important because most of the major sea routes that the Soviet Navy would use would pass through Greenland, at least in some context. It's also the gateway to the Arctic, which is, essentially the quickest way to reach Russia from the Americas and from Canada. And so even though it might seem as like this very far off, negligible rock, just location-wise, it's actually very important for national security. And then on top of that, there is a lot of untapped resources there, right? It's one of the parts of the world that just because it's so remote and just because there isn't that many people there, there's a lot of untapped potential within.
So what you're basically saying is that it's necessary for shipping reasons and because of just their resources there that we need as a matter of national security. So are those resources? Let's stick to the shipping route issue because I did some reading obviously to prepare for this. So I was looking at the DoD put out in the Arctic Strategy Guide. They were talking about the not just the mineral issues in the Arctic region generally, including the European part of the Arctic, but they're really focusing on those shipping routes and on those minerals, and they're talking about how with the reduction in the ice caps in the north, those sea routes are opening, and the Russian claims two of those sea routes are expanding and getting further out. So how does and Trump was actually just talking about this also in his before he was inaugurated as the 47th president. He was talking about how there are Russian and Chinese ships going all over the Arctic and it just needs to stop. And that was highlighted in that DoD briefing. So what is the actual realistic threat picture? So let's say that the Russians are going to try to cause issues for the United States in some capacity. What does that really mean in terms of they interrupt shipping? What type of shipping is going to be disrupted? Why would that actually interrupt the United States' ability to defend ourselves?
Mm-hmm. So I think overall, it's mostly an issue of sphere of influence, right? So on the economic front, obviously you have the piece of if Russia and China also increase their ability to do, let's say, offshore oil drilling with these newly opened areas that weren't previously accessible, um, that's something that everyone wants a cut of, right? And so if the U.S. can establish some kind of ability to tap into those resources, vice the Russians or the Chinese, everyone's going to go for it. But also just in terms of binational security interests, right? Don't forget, Russia still has a very formidable and effective nuclear submarine force. One that, if it's able to pass through undetected, can fairly easily get into the territorial waters of the United States. And while do I think that the U.S. and Russia are going to, escalate into a full-scale conflict? No, not at least in the short term, and even
Hope
potentially
that's
long term.
reassuring.
Hopefully, yeah, hopefully. But beyond that, it's still a threat that needs to be covered down on, right? Like just because the Soviet Union went away doesn't mean that Russia isn't still a near peer adversary in a lot of meaningful ways. And so there are national security gaps that the U.S. is responsible for those, and those shipping lanes and that route is essentially, as far as I can tell.
Okay, so what would that look like in terms of what are the policy possible solutions? What are the different options? Because the DoD in that Arctic strategy pamphlet, and I'm gonna play for you. I'll just explain their side for the viewers who probably haven't read that, and then I'll share with you an article that was written by Cindy Merkins. I don't know if you know her, but she had a response to the strategy. So the DoD basically outlined the current strategy and building on that strategy, which is called monitor and respond, which appears to be some sort of strategy of having light intelligence and sonar abilities in that region to monitor what goes on in the Arctic and then to respond as each issue presents itself.
Mm-hmm.
Sidney Merkins, who graduated from I think the Naval Academy, had been discussing that it might be time to increase our advanced capabilities in that region just to be able to take a more proactive approach, especially now that the Russians are bogged down in Ukraine and can't deploy their resources in the Arctic as efficiently. So what does that all really mean? And which of those could you just like explain those two sides of that argument?
Yeah. So first off, it's important to understand that we already have a military presence in Greenland. Right, there are military installations that are in agreement with the government in Greenland. We have them established. I think there's an air base up on like the northwestern
Yeah,
coast of Greenland.
it's now
Um,
Space Force base.
yeah, now Space Force Base, of course. But yeah, so like there is already a military presence on the island, and I think that generally speaking, it's not so much of a new strategy as much as it is a continuation of old policy, from what I've seen. So, for instance, policy for most of the Cold War was that the U.S. Nuclear submarines in the Arctic were hunting and playing almost cat and mouse with Russians because everyone was trying to find out what everyone else was doing, right? No one wanted to find out that there was a Russian sub sitting 10 miles off the coast of New York City when it was too late. And so there was a lot of cat and mouse of sending U.S. nuclear submarines for months at a time into the Arctic to try to snuff out each other. So that way everyone had intelligence on what everyone else was doing. Right. So kind of going along with the whole mutually assured destruction policy at the time, it was basically just keeping an eye out on your adversaries and just getting an understanding of what they're doing. I see this as probably a minor continuation of that. The desire to increase that ability probably stems from if you see a gap in your adversary's ability, you want to exploit that gap as quickly and as effectively as possible. And if your adversarial country, let's say Russia, is currently bogged down in a massive war where their navy isn't so much involved in it, but those are resources going to something else, then you can exploit a vulnerability and shore up a gap that they're not paying attention to necessarily.
So that all makes, I think that makes sense to me. But what would that look like in terms of if we want to go about increasing that posture in that region? Would that mean that we need more bases in Greenland? Would we need to build up our naval presence in Greenland? How would we actually build that up and take advantage of this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the majority of that increase would probably be through infrastructure. Probably increase U.S. presence, more adding more routes of U.S. shipping in terms of naval patrols going into that area. You'd probably see either an expansion of installations that already exist or the creation of new ones, or like smaller installations along different areas that they're trying to cover down on. That's my assumption. I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to how the Trump administration negotiates with the government of Greenland. And actually comes to an agreement on these kinds of things, because we already, as far as I believe, we already have a defense agreement with Greenland itself, and this would probably just be an expansion for that.
Um, okay, so then the second thing that her article brought up, and I'd love to hear your reaction on this, was, and this is something that we're seeing in the news, at least from the Russian sources. So I like to read also adversarial news content, because I think gives you an insight into what your adversaries are thinking. So the Russians blame a lot of this war in Ukraine on NATO advancement and expansion into that part, into like increasingly Eastern expansion into the European front and closing in on their borders. So an argument that might be made in the Arctic region is similar. If we increase our positions there, that might aggravate the Russians and cause a response from them. Is that not realistic when they're already fighting a war in the European front? What would that look like?
I think in terms of pushing Russia's buttons, um,
Let's not
the
talk about any red buttons.
yeah, absolutely. But when it comes to escalation, right, of whether it's rhetoric or actual actions, um, it's a pretty common tactic that they will escalate in a way that doesn't violate maybe some kind of international treaty or like really cause a problem, but it's still something provocative. And then when another country understandably responds, then they're like, "Oh my God, they're escalating the situation." When it's like, "Okay, but you were here first." Um, and so, if Russian oil rigs were getting developed in the Arctic within Russia's territorial waters that are now ocean water instead of sea ice, that might be one thing. But then if you're pushing ships way into the Arctic and clearly going beyond the scope of what you're doing before, that's a provocation. Especially when you're talking about a backyard that is so small. And it's going to attribute a response from the United States or really anyone that's involved in that, in the same way that China is provoking within the
South
Pacific
China Sea
Ocean.
waters, yeah,
Exactly, it's the same exact tactic. It's just in the cold instead of the South China Sea.
got it. So that's actually interesting that you're bringing up the China aspect of it. So we know that the war in Ukraine has pushed the Russians and the Chinese closer together, and it seems like they're beginning to cooperate on some Arctic issues, and that's something that the DoD was highlighting. Would a agreement with, and we also see now that President Trump is trying to encourage the state government of Alaska to build up their mineral resources to try to drive up our ability to extract critical resource minerals for our military and civilian technologies. My understanding is that those currently come out of China, and that's part of the conflict with in the issue and with Taiwan. Would increasing our trade agreements and abilities within Greenland, where they might have those same minerals, decrease our general risk with conflict with China because we decrease our dependency on them?
I think, I mean, potentially. I think it's such a long term problem that I don't know that there's an immediate response to that. Only in the sense that, like, you're talking about, even if the Trump administration dove very much hard into the infrastructure development to extract these resources, or first built a relationship with Greenland and then made the requisite investments to pull the same resources. You're talking about a project that would take multiple decades to really see something come to fruition from it, right? I mean, the the Taiwanese ability to mass produce chips took a long time to establish, and the U.S. is starting to catch up to it. But even then, we're only, I think, like 2 or 3% of the market share.
That's not great.
Yeah.
Correct me, those chips are in everything from your iPhone, your fridge, to our military satellites, right? Like literally everything.
They're used quite a bit. Yeah.
So okay, so that's what they're calling, right? Friendshoring is trying to move those critical resources from adversarial countries to friendly countries, right?
Yeah, because you have to realize too, like, okay, let's say you get the resources, you then have to make the ability to take those resources, turn them into something usable. Then you have to make the factory that can turn that mineral ability or that iron ore, whatever it is, into something like a chip, right? So it's multiple stage processes. In the same way of when we created the atom bomb, right? It took like what, a couple hundred different factories and abilities just to create a little bit of plutonium. Like, there's a lot of different pieces that all come together. Taiwan has just worked well in that they've created most of those things indigenously within Taiwan, and so they can do it all at home.
Okay, so we have to learn from them. I'm assuming we have resources to learn from them. Um, so I just want to ask you a little bit more now. Now we've talked a little bit about Greenland. Just before we move on, is there anything else that you think that our viewers should know about Greenland?
Well, I think in general, and this is purely just my opinion, but I would be surprised if Trump actually wants to buy Greenland.
Hmm.
I think what he's trying to do, which is understandable, is he's trying to create a stronger relationship. And you've ever heard the idea of, like, if you want to get something in a negotiation, you should ask for something really crazy and then talk down to what you actually wanted. I think this is more a case of that. I think Trump wants to create a much more sustainable relationship with Greenland. Um, One of the Marine Corps units that I was with, this is speaking to Iceland specifically, but obviously same sphere of influence. The 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit regularly ports in Reykjavik. In fact, there was an article a few years ago, a very famous one, because the Marines that were on the ship drank Reykjavik dry of beer.
I actually think I saw that story. Was that a fun night? Were you there?
I was not on that one, unfortunately. I would have loved to have been there. But like that illustrates my point of, like, these places are places that we go to regularly, and also, fairly speaking, if Trump is able to create a beneficial trade agreement with a place like Greenland or Iceland in the future, whatever it may be, that's a stopover for most Americans who fly to Europe. Right? There are plenty of people I know who fly to Reykjavik because it's a cheap flight there and a cheaper flight to Europe as a layover, and it's easier to do that because you're cutting half the distance. So if Trump can make a mutually effective trade agreement with Greenland and then increase U.S. tourism, increase our trade ability, increase domestic spending there, increase our defense posture there, these are all benefits that will add to the U.S. economy,
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Well,
whether or not we own it.
right. Well, no, so we don't have to own it. I think I happen to agree with you. I think that we're not going to end up buying it. I think what he's trying to do is he's overplaying the hands because the Greenlanders, I think, want independence. And there's a lot of polling that indicates that the majority of their populace wants independence from Denmark, right? Because they're currently owned by Denmark. So I think he's trying to use this as a leverage to get the Danish to relinquish their claims to Greenland, make an independent country, then create a lot of bilateral agreements in terms of trade, in terms of defense, and try to shore us up there,
Yeah,
which would be good.
it's no secret that colonial systems are not very popular anymore on the world stage,
Or on
and
college campuses.
or on college campuses. And if Trump can kind of inadvertently show of, like, oh, so maybe Greenland isn't as independent as you claim it to be, it'll probably increase within Greenland's population the desire for actual independence.
Right. Yeah, I think that's what we're saying. I think that's exactly what we're saying, and that would be great. Um, I don't know if you can. I don't know if I wonder if it would be the smallest country by population, like 56,000 people there.
It would definitely be close. I mean, technically, I think the Vatican is the smallest, but
Oh yes, the Vatican is its own country. That is true. That is true. It's very small, very nice country. I don't know if you have you been.
I got the chance to visit. Yes.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Though now the Pope's talking about putting up walls and telling us that we can't have borders ourselves. So I don't know about
Of course.
that.
Yeah, I wouldn't know anything about that.
Okay, so now if we could just quickly pivot to Ukraine, um, what's your assessment in terms of we've been seeing this war dragging on for many months now. Just a personal story, a quick background on my relationship with Ukraine. I was actually studying abroad, and we were supposed to be going on a trip to Poland to visit like different concentration camps and whatnot. And I remember asking, what happens if the Russians invade Ukraine? And everybody in my program looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, you guys don't really follow the news and aren't aware, but I remember Ted Cruz coming to the Senate floor and talking about these pipelines, and he says, if you Joe Biden get rid of these sanctions on these pipelines, you're going to end up with a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And they were increasing their threat posture, they're increasing all their troops on their border, and then eventually they invaded. That was years ago. So now we're many years into this conflict.
Mhm.
It seems like the borders aren't moving so much in terms of where they currently are. A little give here and there, but nothing so significant. What's your assessment of your personal assessment of the assessment of the United States government in terms of the actual progress on the war? Is there any if we give the Ukrainians more time, are they going to be able to push the Russians back a little bit more? Where are we?
So I think the most apt description I've heard of the war as it stands is World War One with drones.
Oh, well, that's not great.
Yeah, and if you actually look at the front, or at least a decent chunk of the front line, it has turned into trench warfare in a lot of ways, right? So it turned into these very in-depth, effective defensive positions with a lot of back and forth. And as soon as one side comes out into the open, whether it's an open field or crossing some terrain, they're just bombarded by drones and small arms fire or artillery fire. And so the problem is that both I think both militaries are so stretched thin in a lot of logistic ways that they're having trouble amassing the needed strength you would need to do a breakthrough. I mean, the Ukrainians showed a pretty effective ability when they went to Kursk, when they actually pushed into Russian territory. I don't think anyone was really expecting that. And I think it was a pretty clear message from Zelensky trying to say, hey, we're still in this fight and we still have kind of that grit. Um, so stand by us, especially with administrations changing. Um, but I think it's at a point now where there is enough of a stalemate that I think hopefully both sides are interested in negotiation at some point. And I'm sure that the U.S. and especially the Trump administration will probably push that agenda forward.
So you're talking about this trench warfare with drones. I mean, there were some reports coming out of North Korean soldiers, just like not even. I don't even know what they thought they were doing. It wasn't like they were trying to like pull up on a flank. They were doing nothing. They were just slowly standing up, marching across an open kill field. Is there like an assessment that like the Russians need the North Koreans, or they're trying to negotiate something with Kim? Like, why are they relying on what are very clearly horribly ineffective, useless soldiers? Like, it's
Well, I would.
wild.
It is. I think on the bingo card, no one was going to put down North Korea troops fighting Ukraine. I don't know specifically. I haven't read personally any like direct assessments about it. Nor would I probably be able to share them if I did. But uh, my basic view on it is that this is more, I think, a show of material and solidarity support between kind of this new, if you want to call it boys club between Russia, North Korea, China, of basically saying like, hey, like we are supporting each other. Russia has consistently supported the Kim Jong Un regime, um, and then his father and his father before him. Like
It's
that has been an
beautiful.
ongoing, yeah, since the days of the Soviets, that has been an ongoing relationship. So it's not surprising that Kim Jong Un wants to basically show like we're capable of supporting too. We don't just need stuff from you; we can also give something. And as a guy who has no qualms about sacrificing his people for whatever he wants,
Yeah.
sending a couple thousand troops in to basically be cannon fodder probably doesn't keep him up at night.
I'm sure it doesn't. Yeah, that's what a lot of these Ukrainian accounts on, especially on X, that you'll see, they're just talking about like these soldiers are just like we're using them for target practice, which is it's a horrible thing to see because like the North Korean people don't have any choice in their life at all. It's like Kim is a wild and horrible human being for sending his people out like that because they're not doing anything. They're really there's actually a very interesting video of one of them talking about he was captured alive which is unique because the Russians have orders, it appears like, to shoot them if they're going to be captured. But there was a report of this captured North Korean soldier who was talking about like, yeah, I'd definitely like to move here if you'll like take me into your country.
Yeah. I think there's very much a like. I think the best hope for any North Korean soldier right now is to be a POW.
Yeah. So
I don't exactly see an upcoming exchange in which Ukraine has diplomatic talks with North Korea to give them back the
yeah, no, yeah, I think that's exactly right. Another thing that we've been seeing, though, there are a lot of discussions, especially more in the right wing circles, and especially further probably on the isolationist wing of the Republican Party than where Donald Trump is, in terms of, we're sending a lot of weapons there, and that this is depleting our resources. Is that really true? Because I saw some reports saying that we're getting rid of old weaponry that we would have to destroy anyway, and this is just a free way of getting rid of those. How much of that is true? What's true? What's not true?
Yeah, so I know that in at least previous to now, there's been a usage of material that was basically slated for destruction. Right, you can only keep a 155 artillery shell for so long before something in it goes bad and it's not usable anymore. So if you're coming up on like, hey, this stuff's basically about to quote unquote expire, versus hey, can we give it to these guys? It makes sense to give it to your allies or to your who you're supporting. I don't know to the extent of how much it has potentially decreased the U.S. arsenal. My guess is that the military-industrial complex is doing just fine.
Maybe too good. They might be doing too good.
Oh, that's it. That's a whole discussion for another time. But by and away, like taking something that isn't being used and allowing it to have a better purpose that helps with a person we're trying to provide material support to makes total sense.
Okay, so basically, it's not that big a deal. The isolationists, they're getting a little bit over carried away in terms of at least that part of the argument from your perspective.
I understand where the worry can come from. I completely can get behind being concerned that if you're giving too much material or logistical support away, then okay, well, what are we keeping? Because you need something in reserve for the homeland. Because especially in this world, who the hell knows?
Right.
So I can understand a little bit of an isolationist step, but also I think that's why we have a representative republic where you have all sides. Some are saying, hey, we need this. Some are saying, hey, let's hold back, because it at least allows the debate of, okay, is this a good idea? Let's actually talk it through or fight about it, and then we'll come to it.
Okay, so then actually one last question, just springing from what you just said. For those of us who don't know actually the great details in terms of how the government interacts with our military, when those decisions are being made in terms of our stockpiles and our resources and our threat posture, how much control does Congress and how much knowledge do the congressional members, both the members in the House and the senators, do they really have the necessary information and expertise to help make those decisions? We're not a nation that's generally, our civilian leaders don't have that much military experience generally anymore, with the exception of J.D. Vance now as vice president. So what does that look like? Our leaders are capable of making those decisions or no?
I would say yes, and the reason I say that is because one thing this country at any leadership level has done pretty effectively, I think, is we do a good job of, even when the leader doesn't know everything, they have advisors who do. Right? The president can't be expected. I mean, don't get me wrong, like we've had like some seriously intelligent, like Menson level presidents, but most of the time, any given president can't be expected to know everything about any given topic, but he still has to make a decision on them. And so that's why we have a National Security Council. That's why we have very effective experts who can come in and say, hey, Mr. President or DOD or foreign military sales, right? This is what, based off our experience, we're seeing and what we would like to see. And it at least allows that expertise. But I think the question comes in, are the members of Congress that are making decisions on this smart enough to listen to advisors and very smart people when they give them advice?
I think the viewers can maybe make that assessment for themselves, but it might be obvious.
I'm not giving my opinion on that.
Yeah, I think I will. I don't think most of the members are too. We suffer. It appears like we suffer. We don't have the most intelligent people, or we have people who are too intelligent who have just abandoned common sense. It doesn't seem. It's actually one of the things in my background. I'm a very big student in terms of learning about military from Napoleonic strategy and the European continent. It's like there's what to learn, and it's very accessible, I think, to most civilians, just people who aren't necessarily don't have the military background. You can learn about military strategy. You can read the reports from the Institute of Study of War. You can all of these things are publicly available, and you can educate yourself by talking to wonderful members of the military like yourself, or by reading a book. So I recommend anybody who's listening, and if there anybody ever in Congress who actually wants to learn things about the military, they should take the time to do so because it is the bedrock of our nation. So thank you so much for coming on. Do you have any last remarks for our viewers?
No, I mean, just to caveat on what you said, like this, there's the old adage of a country that doesn't respect its soldiers or look to its leaders for guidance, right? I'm definitely butchering the saying, but basically, you need to have both sides of that coin because otherwise, the fighting will be done by guys who don't know how to fight, and the thinking will be done by fools. You need people who have an understanding of the military and have usually some kind of service to the country or public service. Doesn't have to be the military, but someone who has buy-in, while also understanding you don't know everything, and following along with people who have more experience than you only benefits you in the long run anyway.
All right, could not have said that better myself. So thank you so much for being on our first episode, and again, thank you so much for your service.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
Okay, so we just heard from our very first guest on the podcast, Staff Sergeant Benjamin Craig. And what we want to do at the outro of each podcast is to give a summary in under 7 minutes, or about 7 minutes, regarding everything that we heard, and then some of my reflections and thoughts, and I'll bring in some maps and different things in this, in the case of this episode. So what we primarily talked about was, should we buy Greenland? Is Donald Trump crazy for wanting to buy Greenland? Should we have some other sort of policy toward Greenland, and why are there interests in Greenland, and what does that all look like? So what we essentially learned was that, one, it's longstanding U.S. policy to be interested in Greenland. We know that that was a serious national security issue in World War II, and it was the previous policy of the United States to try to expand into the Arctic. And we also learned that there are a bunch of reasons for wanting to do that now. So some of those reasons had to do with shipping. So if you look at the map on your screen, what you'll see is there are 3 different primary trade routes. And actually, according to the DoD report that we're talking about during the podcast, there are a lot of new shipping routes that are opening up as some of the ice is melting there. Whether or not you want to say that's due to global warming, whatever it is, ice is melting. So what that means is there's an increased amount of trade availability in the region, and that also means there's increased area for military exercises. So that is becoming an increased threat to the United States, both in terms of the general trade and because of Russian and Chinese ships coming closer to our continent. So that's one serious issue that we learned about, and Greenland can help combat that. So if we put up more bases in Greenland through some sort of new trade agreement with them, with some sort of new military agreement, we can put up some bases and monitor that region better. Because our current base there is pretty small. It's mostly for that monitor and respond type of strategy that we're talking about, and it supports scientific research and a couple of other different things there. So that was one part of Greenland. The other part of the reason why Greenland is of strategic interest is because of the minerals and also gas. But we didn't get into gas in this episode. Maybe we'll leave that to the next episode. But there are a lot of critical minerals that we currently depend on China for. And in a conflict with Russia or with China, given that they're close allies, we're not going to be able to depend on those minerals. And those minerals are used for everything from the phone that this is being recorded on, to the phone you're watching it on, to military technology, to your fridge. Everything basically has these chips in them, and these chips require these minerals. And our military satellites and all of our smart military technologies all require these chips as well. So these minerals are really important, and they are pretty rare. And what that means is that whoever controls all of the most or the best areas or deposits of these minerals has a strategic advantage in conflict. So what that means is that we need more of them. So that's why Donald Trump is correct, in my opinion, in trying to encourage Alaska to expand their mining and try to look more into what types of resources they have there, but also to try to acquire Greenland in some capacity. If that means that we actually outright buy Greenland, if that means that we take over Greenland, if that means that we have increased trade agreements with Greenland and pry them away from Denmark, all of those things would seemingly support those interests. Now, the best way to do that is probably just to pry them away from Denmark and to have some increased diplomatic relations with them and build up our military presence there. And that'll help secure those trade routes, and it will also secure those minerals for the homeland defense and for ensuring that we have control over our supply lines. So if we look at some of these maps that are available online, what you'll see that Greenland has a lot of these raw mineral deposits, and in fact, they're estimated to have a lot more than this map actually reveals. And that means that it is really a strategic interest to try to build up those relationships. So we can see that from this map, and we can also see it from this other map, from these other maps that show all of those different mineral deposits where they are on the islands. And if you notice, they're mostly on the outskirts, and that's because also the middle of Greenland hasn't really been fully explored. So there is thought to be an insane amount of deposits in Greenland that we don't even know about yet. So we really need to invest in Greenland to discover these deposits and build them up and use them ultimately to ensure that we have a stable supply of critical minerals for our technologies, both civilian and military. And this last chart that you see on your screen indicates some of those rare earth minerals that are important. And what we're going to get into in another episode, hopefully, is we're going to try to discuss why some of those minerals, exactly what their locations are in Greenland, and learn more about the actual process from which we derive those minerals and how we can then apply those. So once we understand the supply issues, we can understand how we could best go about a trade agreement with Greenland and what that would look like. So all in all, maybe we should invade Greenland. Or maybe not. Probably not. We should probably just do a trade agreement. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for enjoying the first episode of 7 Minute Expert.